Hello, denizens of the interwebs. This is Diphtherio back again for the third episode of the Economics for the Rest of Us podcast. This week I have to start out by giving a big shout out to Eve Smith over at the Naked Capitalism blog, who was nice enough to feature episode 2 of the Economics for the Rest of Us podcast on her website, nakedcapitalism.com, this Sunday. Thanks so much, Eve, and thanks to all of the great commenters who gave lots of good feedback and lots of good suggestions for improving the podcast. Be sure to be taking all of those into account this week. So I'm back again this week with my good friend DP. How's it going, DP?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good.
All right, well, this week I was thinking that I'd talk a little bit about something called NAIRU.
NAIRU? Is that like that Indian guy with the jacket?
Yeah, no. This is an economics term, actually. This isn't a fashion podcast. NAIRU is an acronym, actually. It stands for Non-Accelerating Inflation Rate of Unemployment.
Non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Wow, that sounds really complicated.
Well, it's not nearly as complicated as it sounds, thankfully. The basic idea here is that if unemployment gets too low, that will cause inflation, which could be a problem. So the basic concept is that the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment is the lowest level of unemployment that we can have in our economy without inflation getting out of hand. So to quote Janet Yellen, the current Federal Reserve chair, the highest level of employment that can be sustained while maintaining a stable inflation rate is the NAIRU. That's how she actually described the natural rate of unemployment, which is often used synonymously with the NAIRU, and in this podcast I'll use them interchangeably.
So, if too many people have jobs, that's bad for the economy?
Well, it's not quite that simple, but yeah, you're kind of starting to get at where we're going to be going with this. So, the story goes like this. If we're in a situation where there's very low unemployment, businesses will be forced to raise their pay levels in order to attract and retain workers. Now, in order to pay for those wage increases, businesses will have to raise their prices. The increase in prices will then cause workers to demand further pay increases, which the business owners will be forced to accept because of the situation of low unemployment, meaning they will have to give raises to their workers and then raise prices once again, passing that wage increase on to the consumers, who themselves are also workers, who once again demand further pay increases. And this repeats in a cycle of accelerating inflation, so we are told. So the rate of unemployment below which inflation is assumed to take off in this manner is called the NAIRU, or the natural rate of unemployment. And one of the concepts that goes along with this NAIRU is the idea that there is cyclical unemployment and structural unemployment. Cyclical unemployment being caused by business cycles, ups and downs in the stock market and things like that, and structural unemployment being caused by, quote, labor market rigidities. Now, government action, it's assumed, can only address cyclical unemployment. Structural unemployment is caused by things like minimum wage laws, the existence of unions, skills mismatch between job seekers and employers, things like this that are built in kind of to the structure of the labor market that cause the unemployment rate to stay at a level that's above zero. NAIRU, then, we can say, is essentially an estimate of this structural unemployment. That's the idea.
So why can't the government do anything to get rid of structural unemployment?
Well, actually, A lot of economists will tell you that the government kind of can do something to get rid of structural unemployment. Usually the kind of things they talk about are creating a more, again, a quote, flexible labor force, which basically means making it easier for employers to fire their employees for no cause, getting rid of unions, subverting minimum wage laws in various ways. All those kind of things are what is meant when you hear somebody talk about creating a flexible labor force.
Oh, that's interesting, because you usually think of a flexible labor force as being a good thing. They always seem to talk about in the news like it's a good thing, but it sounds like when people talk about creating a flexible labor force, they really mean just putting people in a situation where they have to take shittier jobs?
That's pretty much the size of it.
So, what is the NAIRU right now? Or what do they say it is?
Well, the consensus among economists and people at the Federal Reserve seems to be that it's between 5 and 6% somewhere in there is a safe place for the unemployment rate to be. Some will go as low as 4.3%, but everybody is pretty much in agreement that anything less will supposedly cause ruinous inflation in the economy, which is why economists and politicians refer to NAIRU, or to their NAIRU estimate, rather, as full employment. So when you hear somebody who's an economist, say a Paul Krugman or a Janet Yellen or any of these types, or a politician talk about full employment or we've reached full employment or something like that, what they mean is that we've reached this rate of unemployment at which they think if we go any lower, we'll have inflation problems. Now, just a note here, we're going to be using a couple of terms fairly loosely, or we're going to be required to use them fairly loosely in order to be able to talk about these things. They are unemployment and inflation. Now, unemployment, as I've said in my earlier podcast, is greatly understated. So please see the last episode if you want more information on that. And inflation, as we're discussing here, refers specifically to the Consumer Price Index, which is a measure of price levels in the economy that the government puts together, but which does not include things like higher education costs, doesn't include the costs of credit, like how much your credit cards charge you in APR, which is an important part of expenses for many people. But tuition increases and climbing interest rates don't show up in CPI. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about inflation. We're talking about a specific measure of inflation, which may not be the most relevant one for each and every person out there.
So economists think that if unemployment gets too low, that inflation will get out of hand. Is there any evidence for this? I mean, this must have happened sometime before in history, obviously, right?
Well, it's interesting you should ask that. Actually, there's no evidence that this has actually happened, at least not that I can find. Definitely not in recent history in this country or in any other. We have had a couple bouts of inflation. The most recent one was in the 1970s.
And was that inflation caused by too many people having jobs?
No, actually, it was caused by an oil embargo that Saudi Arabia imposed on us. And that actually led to not only higher prices, price inflation, but higher unemployment as well. So we had kind of the opposite thing happen of what most economists would have expected in the 1970s, where we had high unemployment and high inflation, called stagflation, stagnation and inflation together. So that inflation was definitely not caused by overly low unemployment. Now, in the late 1990s, we had a situation where unemployment actually fell to 4%, which is considerably lower than the estimates for NAIRU at the time and right now. And despite this fact, there was no inflation.
None at all?
Well, like we said in the note, none in the Consumer Price Index. And at the time that unemployment was 4%, Around 98, 99, the NAIRU was supposedly 5.2%. So if the theory was valid, we would have expected to see a whole bunch of inflation, or at least the beginnings of inflation, accelerating inflation then, but we didn't.
So basically what you're saying is this is just one more instance of economists being totally full of shit.
Well, to be perfectly fair, not every single economist actually agrees with the concept of NAIRU. Just the ones whose opinions actually matter and form our economic policy.
Oh, well, that's real reassuring, thanks.
One of the interesting things that did happen, though, is that a lot of the structural causes of unemployment that we mentioned a little bit earlier just started to fix themselves.
Started to fix themselves?
Yeah, it was pretty interesting, actually. As economist James Devine notes, and this is a quote, "In the late 1990s, Business Week reported that many employers were hiring people they normally wouldn't hire because of inadequate skills, wrong location, or poor attitudes, and then training them for the jobs available. This meant that the problem of structural or mismatch unemployment was being attacked." While the normal view of NAIRU is that it represents the structural unemployment in our economy, and that if we sink below that, we'll cause inflation for that reason. Actually, what happened when we went below NAIRU was that more people got jobs, and that a lot of those structural problems stopped being such problems.
So, let me get this straight. Mainstream economists and people in government think that if unemployment gets too low, inflation will get out of hand, even though there hasn't been any evidence that that's ever happened in the past?
Well, yeah, that seems to be the case.
Do they do anything to try to affect the unemployment rate? Like, maybe to keep it from getting below this NAIRU number?
Well, actually, yeah, they do, although they don't often talk about it in quite those terms. The Federal Reserve, which I will just refer to as the Fed, thinks that it can influence unemployment rates through setting interest rates, which it does. Basic idea being that the lower the interest rate is, the lower unemployment will be, and that the higher the interest rate is, the higher unemployment will be. And, to no one's surprise ever, the Federal Reserve tends to err on the side of lower inflation and higher unemployment.
So are you saying that if the Federal Reserve thinks that unemployment is getting too low, like maybe below the NAIRU, that it raises interest rates to try to stop that from happening?
Well, yes, that's pretty much exactly what they do. In short, the Fed is trying to prevent unemployment from falling below their presumed non-inflationary rate of unemployment, which means they're trying to keep unemployment from getting too low. But of course, they use the rhetoric of controlling inflation to justify this. The Federal Reserve actually has a dual policy mandate, two things that they're supposed to do. One is to try to get the economy to maximum employment, and the other one is to try to maintain stable price levels in the economy. To quote, once again, Janet Yellen, the FOMC, that's the Federal Open Market Committee, part of the Federal Reserve, the FOMC conducts policy to promote maximum employment and price stability as required by our statutory mandate from Congress. Now, that maximum employment, of course, is the NAIRU. So right now, the consensus among the Federal Reserve economists seems to be that the NAIRU is somewhere in between 5 and 6%. Now, it's actually fairly common in the business press for people to writers to fret about unemployment perhaps getting too low, thinking that the Fed should do something about that. In fact, even in this subpar economy that we have had ever since 2008, even now, people are already starting to freak out about this. Over a year ago, in a blog in the Wall Street Journal, Real-Time Economics blog, Kathleen Madigan wrote, "If the Fed is wrong about full employment," meaning if the Fed estimate of NAIRU is too low, if the Fed is wrong about full employment, it means wage growth will pick up faster and sooner than central bankers expect. That isn't necessarily a bad trend if it's met with better productivity growth, but bigger pay raises and the implications for inflation may complicate the Fed's job.
Is she seriously saying that people getting bigger pay raises might be a problem?
Right, that's exactly what she's saying. Of course, on the assumption that people getting bigger wages will lead to ruinous inflation.
I gotta say, this sounds totally insane.
Well, it is a pretty confusing policy, I have to say, or it seems like it should be, since most of us get our income exclusively from wages. So having the Federal Reserve actively working to keep wages down is having them work against the interests of a majority of the people. Their explanation to us is that it is really for our own good, since if wages got too high, it would be bad for everybody. So they're inflicting pain on us now to save us from having pain later on.
Supposedly.
Supposedly, that's what they say. Of course, as you just pointed out, there's no particular evidence for that claim that there'll be pain later on if we, God forbid, let the unemployment rate fall below 5%, which, as we pointed out in the last episode, is a greatly understated number. So, while we don't know that low unemployment will actually lead to ruinous inflation, we do know that when employees get less, generally the owners get more, and keeping wages down makes sure that owners and executives are going to have plenty of money to pay themselves with.
You know, every time I talk to you, I just come away angry. The Federal Reserve thinks that it can manipulate the unemployment rate by manipulating the interest rate.
Well, that's at least one of the things that they think manipulating the interest rate does.
It's apparent that you think the Federal Reserve has its head up its hiney in a lot of ways. Is it possible that maybe they're mistaken about this and that their interest rate policies haven't really had any effect on employment?
Well, I think if we look at the actual record, we would have to say that the answer is probably yes. Whether or not Federal Reserve's interest rate policy has been the major factor in getting us where we are today, or just one of many factors, is, really hard to say. But whatever the cause, the goal of suppressing wages and making sure unemployment stays at an acceptable level for somebody seems to have been successful. The Federal Reserve themselves actually reported recently that 47% of Americans couldn't even come up with $400 in an emergency.
That's amazing. Wow. I thought it was just me who was broke as shit all the time.
No, apparently you've got quite a bit of company.
Well, I guess that's somehow strangely comforting?
Yeah, I guess that's maybe one way to look at it. The National Bureau of Economic Research recently reported that over the 32 years from 1979 until 2011, the 40% of people in the middle of the income distribution, the middle class, only saw their pay increase by 0.1 to 0.7% per year, which is statistically indistinguishable from zero. Might as well be nothing. Meanwhile, the top 1% saw their yearly gains range from 3.4% to 3.9%. That's a level which the NBER themselves referred to as astronomical.
Astronomical.
So the wealthy have been making out like bandits, while the majority of us have been struggling just to tread water. The International Business Times reported just this week that a third of U.S. manufacturing workers have to rely on welfare, food stamps, and other forms of government assistance just to make ends meet. At the same time, the Washington Post reports that the average CEO compensation is now $12.259 million per year. Or, to put it a different way, about 4 times what a mechanical engineer can expect to make in a lifetime. That's right. Average CEO makes 4 times in 1 year what your average college-educated, highly productive mechanical engineer makes in a lifetime.
That has got to be one of the craziest things you've told me in at least the last minute.
And as many people know, wages have failed to keep up with productivity since around the early 70s, which means that workers have been taking home a smaller and smaller portion of the value that their work creates, which means that consequently business owners and executives have been taking home more and more of the value that those workers create. If you've ever wondered exactly how those corporate CEOs can pay themselves so much, now you know. So, yep, I think we can call this a policy success.
We can definitely call it something.
Of course, it's not just the actions of the Fed that have led to the hollowing out of the middle class. Free trade agreements like NAFTA and TPP have also helped to keep U.S. unemployment rates at acceptable levels. You can listen to the first episode of this podcast if you want more details on that.
So, do you think it would be possible for the government to just, get rid of unemployment if they wanted to?
Well, actually, I'm pretty convinced that the answer is yes. The Federal Reserve, besides manipulating interest rates, they also were involved in bailing out the banks not too long ago.
Oh yeah, I seem to recall reading something about that.
Indeed. The Federal Reserve essentially created trillions of dollars in order to use those dollars, to buy things, financial documents, financial loans, financial assets from the banks when they were in so much trouble during the crisis. Now, instead of the Federal Reserve just giving those trillions of dollars away to Wall Street banks through quantitative easing, they could just as easily give that money to cities and counties to hire unemployed or underemployed people to improve their localities.
Like, by doing what kind of stuff?
I don't know. You could have people visit shut-ins, tutor students, maybe work in community gardens, not to mention fixing up all of our failing infrastructure. That would get rid of involuntary unemployment in a heartbeat. Everyone who's willing to work could have a paying job, and we wouldn't have to raise taxes to pay for it. Just like the Federal Reserve gave trillions of dollars away to the banks during the bailout in 2008, they didn't have to raise anybody's taxes or borrow any money to do it. So there's no reason that we can't do exactly the same thing to bail out the working class. And unlike the banks, we actually deserve it. Really, the only thing standing in the way is a lack of political will.
And an economic theory with no evidence to back it up.
Well, that's all for the podcast this week. I hope you got something out of it. And I hope to see you again, or hear from you, listen to you, have you listen to me again next week on the Economics for the Rest of Us podcast.